The topic is the Voting Rights Act of 1965, and we have to talk about the Voting Rights Act of 1965, Attorney Michael McDonald. And of course, Attorney McDonald, before we had our first commercial break, we promised that we'd give you an opportunity to continue our discussion in reference to the suffrage or the vote in early America. Go on, let's continue from there.
Well, before the break we were talking about the four areas. Basically was four procedures or four tools that were used to prevent or to limit the rights of Negroes or African Americans to vote. The first I mentioned was this grandfather exemption, which allowed for someone whose grandfather was eligible to vote in 1860 to continue to vote even after the passage of the 15th Amendment. Of course, Negroes were not eligible to vote in 1860, therefore that exemption didn't benefit them, and not too long after that the Supreme Court ruled that that was unconstitutional. The second way in which the rights of Negroes have been abridged is through something we call the white primary. And white primaries were held in the South primarily by Southern Democrats, Dixiecrats, who basically would hold elections, primaries involving the major candidates and exempt Negroes from participating in the primary. So by the time they got to the general election in which they could vote, the process was already completed. The individual who was going to ultimately win was picked during the primary election.
This is why it's called the white primary.
Right. And so this was also found unconstitutional by the Supreme Court, and states were required to remove those primaries. The third type of restriction was something we call poll tax. And a poll tax was simply, it was a fee levied in order for someone to vote. And what's strange about poll taxes was that in the South, those taxes became available during a period of time when sharecroppers had the least amount of money. So strangely enough, if you couldn't afford to pay the poll tax, you couldn't vote. And then the fourth type of restriction is something we know as a literacy test. And this is probably the one that most people are more familiar with, where you literally had to take an examination in order to even register to vote. And usually some of the questions related to understanding the U.S. Constitution or state constitution. There are even some questions just as outrageous as asking the applicant how many bubbles are there in a bar of soap, and some situations where in the voter registration offices there would be a fishbowl full of marbles, and the applicant would be asked to define the actual number of marbles in the fishbowl. These were the types of gimmicks and obstacles that Negroes faced. And prior to the Voting Rights Act of 1965, there were fewer than 70 black elected officials in the United States. Following the passage of the Voting Rights Act of 1965, the number shot up to 2,080. And right now we have over 9,000 elected officials that are African American descent, and many people attribute that to the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Now, of course, the act wasn't passed without much upheaval and a lot of resistance. There were four incidents, or actually occurrences, that I think played a major role in the passage of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. The first was something we call Bloody Sunday, and that represented the march from Selma, Alabama to Montgomery, Alabama, where blacks who were going to march to Montgomery to basically confront then Governor George Wallace about the obstacles that many blacks faced. Again, it was a situation where literacy tests were still being administered, and Governor Wallace had actually mobilized the Alabama state troopers to prohibit these voters from crossing the Edmund Pettus Bridge. And many of these individuals were beaten and critically injured, and so it became known as Bloody Sunday. Bloody Sunday. And it gained coverage from around the world. The second incident involved the murder of 3 civil rights workers in Philadelphia, Mississippi, who were killed by members of the Klan, and also with some collusion or conspiracy activity on the part of the Nabosha County, Mississippi Sheriff's Department. And so those 2 incidents, along with 2 other things, The third being Fannie Lou Hamer, who was from Mississippi, who was a part of the integrated Mississippi delegation to the 1964 Democratic Convention that wanted to be seated, but there was an all-white Democratic delegation from Mississippi. And as you know, that incident itself marked a major impact on the Voting Rights Act. And then the fourth element, of course, was the role of President Lyndon Johnson, who became a major champion for civil rights at the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, Civil Rights Act of 1965, and then eventually the Housing Act of 1968. President Johnson, because of his finesse and his ability to having worked in Congress, his ability to work with the Southern Democrats, was instrumental in the passage of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. So those four elements really played a major role in the passage of the act.
You know, we've got a couple of minutes before our second commercial break here, but let's raise this question. We know that Johnson became the president following the assassination of President Kennedy. Yes. And this, certainly you can't say what would have happened had not certain things happened, but do you think that all of this activity in reference to the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Civil Rights Act of 1965, the Voting Rights Act, and all of those activities that Johnson, as the president, put all of his weight and all of his influence behind, do you think that that could have become a reality under President Kennedy?
Again, we don't have the ability to rewrite history, but I do not think we would have had these acts passed with the expediency and with the sense of urgency that they did pass under President Johnson, who again had an understanding about just Southern politics. And I just think, just as a political scientist, you cannot overlook that one fact.
Yeah, well, that's what we found in American history, that Johnson played a very significant role in reference to integration, in reference to civil rights, and et cetera. But yet we find that he rarely receives the credit that he is due in reference to that. And I think, and that's why we raise that question now, that perhaps we can give him some credit, because I think that he played a very significant role in all of those things that we talked about. But this is essentially what we want to do. Now, when we come back after this, the end of this segment, we want to talk about the impact that this act is having and what we can do today in order to make this act a reality. And we'll be back with our audience following this very short commercial break.
Hey Nashville, what's your catchphrase? Hi, I'm Corey Fleming.
The topic is the